Welcome to Casual Friday. Today I'm going to update you on my current knitting projects. I'm going to talk about a question that came up in the Ravelry forums about whether or not it's appropriate to contact a designer directly about a problem you're having with one of their patterns. Then I want to talk a little bit about keeping the joy in the knitting process, what that means to me, why it's important to me, and how I do that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the future of this YouTube channel, some of the things I have in mind for the coming months, and wanting some feedback from you on this. And then I have a little announcement about how you can buy me a coffee with Ko-fi. Okay, I've mentioned in the past couple of weeks that my oldest daughter is about to head off to the Netherlands for a year. She's going to be an au pair for a Dutch family who just had a new baby. And so I've been as excited as I would be if one of my kids just had a baby. And I've knit a couple of things. And I think I showed this hat. It's so I had finished the hat a few weeks ago. This pattern is called Welcome to the Flock. And then I had been working on the little cardigan that matches it, and I just finished it yesterday. I went to St. Paul. There's a really nice fabric store there that I go to every time I need buttons for a project. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what makes me happy about this project and what I wasn't completely satisfied with, and then sort of my process of how I evaluated what I thought the problems were with this project, not with the pattern, but with my results. So the first thing is that this is stranded color work, which is something I've been doing more of this year, but it's not the same kind of stranded color work that I had been doing, which is really alternating more geometric designs where I'm alternating between two colors every couple of stitches and working in the round. This is a cardigan, so I was knitting flat. And the little sheep motifs are sort of solid bits of knitting. And what I have noticed with stranded color work is that when you have, say, a block of stitches that has a vertical line, so that for over several rows you'll have the color starting and ending in the same place or pretty close to the same place. You can get a result that's not really puckering, but it's just a result that isn't as flat as if you were really alternating sort of in different places from row to row. And so I think that's part of, I wasn't completely happy with my tension on this. And so I think part of it has to do with, I used superwash wool, which is completely appropriate for a baby sweater, but it's very slippery. It's not quite as sticky as many yarns that are really good for stranded color work are. So it's a little slippery. I wasn't working in the round. I was working flat. And there were a couple of rows where I had to work in 3 colors rather than 2. Then, as I completed one set of the sheep, there were, I don't know, 3 or 4 rows that separated one set of sheep from the next set of sheep. And that's where there were mass decreases in the yoke. Now, I don't typically knit garments that are raglans or have yokes. I did early on in my knitting life, I did that, but I really prefer other constructions for sweaters, but this is so cute and it's really, having a yoke makes total sense for this pattern. I think part of the issue is like, I ripped out the first set of sheep going around the yoke. I ended up ripping them out when I started the second set. And because I thought, well, geez, it almost looks more gathered, that bottom row of sheep. So I ripped them back and I re-knit them, and they looked great. And then I went and I did that decreased row, and it sort of has that sort of pleating effect in a way. You know, I had sheep that were like this, and then I decreased right above them, And I think that may have done a little bit to compress the fabric or the look of the fabric before it was washed and blocked. It could also be that I'm just not doing a good job with it. So I completed it and I washed and blocked it, knowing that washing and blocking works wonders. And it does look better. I'm pretty happy with it. I think when the little kid wears it, it will be so cute. But it's one of those things where I'm sort of 85% happy with the results. Everyone I've shown it to is like, oh my God, that's so cute. That's so cute. So they're looking at it in a very different way than I'm looking at it as the knitter, and knowing what I was struggling with and what I wanted it to look like. But I took the sweater to St. Paul yesterday to Treadle Yard Goods to pick out buttons. And I knew from looking at what other people on Ravelry had used for buttons, some people use sort of natural color, cream color buttons. Some people use black. And I think some people use some other things. So I assumed I was going to use white or black. I thought maybe black would be better. And I laid out some white buttons, looked good. Found some black that I liked better, but they were a little too big and they didn't have enough of the right size in black. And so then she pulled out this couple of boxes from under the counter of buttons that are mounted on cards. And I knew immediately, oh, these are vintage buttons, probably from somebody in the Button Society. Minnesota has a state button society, and they have a gathering once a year at a hotel here in the Twin Cities. It's all weekend, and they trade and sell with each other, and then the public can go and buy buttons as well. And there's a woman who I know is a member of the Button Society who sells buttons every year at the Minnesota Knitters Guild's Yarn Over event. She's always there, and so I always go to her booth if I've made a cardigan in the past year or I'm about to finish one, and I look at her booth for buttons, because it's just they're so much more interesting than just going to like a craft store or going to like Joann's or someplace like that. I find it just much more, you get much more interesting buttons at a really nice fabric store or at one of these events where someone from the Button Society has buttons. So I was looking through them. She said, here, look through these, and I found these buttons. So they're all different from each other. You can see that they're black and white. They're China. They're made from China. They weren't made in China. They're made from China. And the card said that they dated them from the 1850s to early 20th century. And they called them bullseye, because these all have little circles on them, bullseye gator buttons. And just as I was saying, what are gaiters? I realized what they were. They're like those, the military used to wear them quite a bit, but you'll see them maybe in marching band uniforms and in the days when men wore knee pants, and then they would sometimes wear these, apparently they call them splash dashers or splash dashes as well. So they are things to protect the stockings or lower legs for men. And so they have these like protective leg wraps that we call gaiters now, and you'll see those with skiing. You can have gaiters these days that are nylon and help protect from the snow getting down inside your boots. But anyway, I just love them, and I thought they just really made the sweater. I was really happy with it. So I'm much happier with the sweater now than I was before they had the buttons on it. So here's one more look at that sweater. So the other thing I've been working on is another pair of socks for my brother, who I sometimes call Sasquatch because he's got very big feet. And whenever I start a pair of socks for him, I'm always concerned about whether or not I'll have enough yarn to complete the pair. And if I do, will I have enough yarn to complete the pair so that they match? So I did get the first sock done. I used a contrasting yarn for the heel. I did a peasant heel, and I used a contrasting yarn that is not really the same shade of olive that these stripes are, but I think they work. As I got near the toes, I could see I was going to have enough yarn to do toes for both socks. So I went ahead and did that with the idea that I might take this heel out and redo it in the striped yarn if I wasn't really sure about the heels. But I think I'm going to keep them. So my challenge though for the second sock is matching this kind of wider olive stripe here that has just a very narrow speckled stripe. What happened when I was knitting the first sock is there was a knot, and it wasn't just, so that the yarn was tied together, and it was tied together, the same color. The speckled yarn was tied to another set of speckled yarn, and I didn't think anything about it, and I kept knitting. And then I saw that I had more green after that, and it took me a while. I was probably halfway down the leg before I realized, oh, I bet that knot interrupted the sequence of the colorway. And it did. Because I didn't know when you're starting a sock with self-striping yarn, you often don't know what the striping sequence is going to be, how often a particular color is going to repeat within the total repeat. You don't know. So I have this sort of double wide olive stripe at the top with a very narrow speckled stripe that I have to repeat for the second sock, which will be I've done that once before with a pair of socks where I had something similar. So it is doable, but it does just add a little extra element of challenge to make the socks match. So now I want to talk about whether or not it's appropriate to make direct contact with a designer when you are having trouble with their pattern. This comes up on Ravelry fairly frequently in that somebody will post a problem that they had and with a pattern, and they're asking for help. And sometimes it's totally appropriate that they're asking within Ravelry for help on the pattern. And other times the specific problem they're having, to me, signals that they should be contacting the designer. And I ask, well, have you tried contacting the designer? And sometimes we can ear burn the designer and they'll come in and then they'll explain or do whatever, because it's something that none of us have seen before. We don't really understand. But recently this came up where somebody contacted the designer about something and then was admonished and told that they should never contact the designer. They should come ask for help in the forums. And the thing is, I'm a designer. I do sell patterns. And so I'm also a member of the designers group. And so I see both sides where the designers will sometimes be upset that people haven't contacted them directly about something and were asking for help when it was something that they would have liked to have known there was a problem in the pattern or something like that. But other times they get inundated with questions about things that really have nothing to do with the pattern, but have to do with the knitter not understanding how to do basic techniques, or it might be something that's really outside of the pattern themselves that they're requesting of the designers. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what I consider appropriate or inappropriate contact. So in this case, the designer had included their email address in the pattern, and yet there were still some people who were saying you should never contact them because they might get overwhelmed. And so my response to that is, if a designer has so many patterns that it's a real burden to try to do pattern support via email, they will not put their email address in the pattern. There's a reason they put their email address in the pattern, and that is they do welcome contact if you have problems with their pattern. If they don't put their email address in there, a lot of times the bigger designers will have specific Ravelry groups, and often they'll say that on their pattern page. In the Ravelry, it'll say, if you need support for this pattern, you can come to there's a particular thread on this in my Ravelry group. So they give you information about how to get support for their patterns. Not all designers do this. Some of them aren't on Ravelry at all. Some patterns are tell you who the designer was, but they're published by one of the publishing houses or the yarn company, and so that can be a little bit more difficult or time consuming to get a response back when there is an issue. So I want to talk a little bit about when is it appropriate? What are the kinds of questions that are totally appropriate to ask a designer? First of all, when you contact a designer, if you think that there is a problem in the pattern, like there is a missing instruction, or you think that their stitch counts are wrong, be polite to them. Yes, you paid $5 or $7 for the pattern and you would expect it to be correct, but don't open with an admonishment to them that they wrote a crappy pattern. So people are going to respond to that with defensiveness, and it's not going to make them want to help you. So the best way is to just, first of all, see if you can solve the problem yourself and verify that there actually is a problem, that you are interpreting things correctly and that the pattern is actually wrong. So because you may have been the one who made the error, not them. So if you can't quite work out, or if you've ripped things out a few times and you keep getting the same result, you could ask on Ravelry, am I interpreting these instructions correctly? This is what I'm doing. Or you could contact the designer if the email address is in the pattern and say, I'm having trouble doing this and this is the result I'm getting. Are you sure that these numbers are correct? And just confirming that I'm reading this correctly, because occasionally there are typos. Now, the older the pattern is, especially if there are a lot of people who have knit this pattern, the older the pattern is, the less likely it is that it's an error in the pattern, and more likely it is that it's an interpretation problem on your part. And in that case, you're probably going to get more answers quickly on Ravelry than you might get by contacting the designer. So that's just a clue. Like if it's a brand new pattern, then certainly there might be some things that hadn't gotten caught in the editing process. The kinds of things that are inappropriate to contact a designer about is if you have purchased a pattern or you've downloaded a free pattern and it's sort of like what you want, but you want to use a wildly different yarn weight, and so you don't know how to adjust for that, or you want it to be in a different size than is accounted for in the pattern, then contacting the designer and asking them to modify it for your personal needs is inappropriate. That would be something, so the first suggestion would be try to find a pattern that's similar to that uses the yarn weight you have and that has the size that you would like to knit. And that's something that Ravelers are really good about helping you. You say, I really like this pattern, but I have this yarn and I need this size. Does anybody know of a pattern that's similar? And people are really good about helping you search for things like that. But asking the designer to redesign something for you based on the yarn that you have or the size that you want would not be appropriate. Now, on the other hand, if you've knit this pattern before and you loved it and would like to also see it expanded to more sizes, that is perfectly okay to contact the designer and say, I've knit this, I love it. I would love to also see it in larger sizes or in children's sizes, or maybe it's a child sweater and you'd love to see it upsized to an adult, and ask, do they have any plans to do that? Because if they get sufficient interest in something like that, if they hear this kind of request repeatedly, that's something that they very well might consider. But it's not something you should demand that they do. So that's my little take on it, because I do include my email address in my patterns, because I do expect that if somebody finds an error, suspects an error, or thinks something is written in a way that's not clear to them, I would like to help clarify it for them, or indicate how they might be misreading the pattern. I'm not going to teach them how to knit the pattern. If my pattern requires chart reading, I'm not going to teach them how to read charts. That's not the purpose of, that's not my job in the context of this pattern. It's a skill that they need to learn that's outside of the scope of the pattern. But I would expect, and I hope that there aren't errors, and I do have things test knitted and I'm pretty careful about it, but occasionally there are errors. But usually after a certain period of time, errors have all been found. And the longer ago it was that I wrote a pattern and released a pattern, the less likely I'm going to be able to immediately answer it. I'm not going to remember. I'm going to have to go back, reread the pattern, visualize what's going on, and then try to answer it. So, but this is why many Ravelry designers, or many designers on Ravelry, especially the ones who design lots of things, have groups, because they'll have, for a particular pattern, they'll have a discussion thread, and somebody else may have had that exact problem that you've had, or confusion that you've had, and other people who have made the pattern and the designer themselves may pipe in the first time that the question was asked, and then it would be up to you to read through and find the answer to that question that you have yourself. So now I want to talk about keeping the joy in your knitting. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I'm, planning some changes, possible changes for my channel, and just, playing with ideas and looking at things that I have been doing that I've really enjoyed. Like what do I still enjoy? What do I maybe enjoy less? And I do this in sort of an ongoing manner. And I have done so throughout my knitting life. So about 22 years ago, my sister-in-law asked me if I wanted to go to a knitting store in southern Minnesota called Mary Lou's. Now, Mary Lou's actually was also a knitting mill. They produced their own yarns, but they had this huge showroom of all kinds of knitting related things. And so I went with her. And it was on multiple levels. I remember that. And I remember coming down these stairs and seeing off to like my left these machines and set up. And I'm like, and I said, what are those? And she said, oh, those are knitting machines. And she happened to own one. She had bought one sometime after she finished graduate school and had bought herself a knitting machine and had used it a number of times and hadn't used it recently. I had never heard that she had such a thing. So she was telling me about it and how it made knitting go faster, and she had enjoyed it. And I thought, well, that sounds like it's something I might be interested in. So I started researching it, and eventually I bought a knitting machine. I bought this electronic knitting machine that I also had software on my computer called Design a Knit, and it allowed me to do things like I could pick that I wanted to knit size 2, like toddler sweater, could tell it what my gauge was, whether I wanted it to be pullover or cardigan, V-neck, what kind of sleeves, all that kind of stuff. And then it would sort of calculate the canvas of that sweater. It's very similar to the way, if any of you have ever used this old piece of software called, I think it was called Knitting Wizard or Knit Wizard, would do the same sort of thing for hand knitting. It would sort of create a bare bones pattern for you based on things, and you could make modifications, like you could adjust the amount of ease that you had in certain areas, or to accommodate various preferences that you might have. But what it gave me was, it gave me a little canvas, and then I was designing intarsia colorwork patterns for these little sweaters, and I was having so much fun with it. And then the design could download to my knitting machine, and then the knitting machine there's like this whole bed of, they're like latch hooks if you've ever done rug hooking. There's like a whole, maybe 120 hooks or something like that in this bed, and you can take some of them out of work. Like if you only need 40 of them, you could take the other 80 out. And then you have the yarn is all threaded through to this carriage that sits on the bed of needles. And to knit a row, you push the carriage across, and then to knit the next row, you do it back. And so my machine could handle 4 different colors, and it would change the colors on the appropriate row. I had to keep track of what row it was on, because I would have to manually bind off for the underarms, would have to manually do any decreases or increase shaping. But otherwise, the whole row could be done very quickly. It still would take me about 7 hours to knit a baby sweater, in terms of doing the finishing work and picking up for the buttonhole bands. Some of the stuff I did by hand. But I was having a lot of fun with it, and I thought, oh, this could, I could sell my sweaters. And I was, in some like baby child, mother child groups or parent child groups. and some of the other parents were interested in the sweaters. And so I was selling some of them, and I was custom designing based on what they had in mind, and they were all really happy with it. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll go. There's like a little children's boutique sort of nearby, independently owned, not a chain thing. And I thought maybe I could sell my sweaters over there. So I took over a bunch of photographs of my work, and she said very complimentary about it. And she says, but look, this is the situation for my customers. My customers are not going to want multicolored sweaters. They're going to want something in a neutral color that they could use with any outfit that their kid was wearing, and probably in a chunkier knit. And she said, and the price point that my customers are going to want to pay is about $60, which means I can only pay you $30. So I'm thinking 7-8 hours of work for $30, that isn't worth it to me. And then I started also thinking about what I would have to do. So then I was thinking about what are some other ways that I could do this kind of knitting, but get all of the profit. And I was playing around with different ideas, and I realized I would have to reproduce the same sweaters over and over again, and that wasn't interesting to me. So that was the point where I made this decision. What I really liked was the creative designing aspect of it. What I didn't, and I liked making one thing and seeing that my idea actually worked and loving that. I did not like the idea of being a sweatshop for my own work, or finding other people to be my sweatshop. That was not interesting to me. So I realized in order for me to preserve what I really liked, I had to let go of the idea of making money off of these types of sweaters. So at the time, I was also doing, just starting to do fiction writing, and I got really involved in that for a while. And I did less and less knitting. And then I lost my writing voice. I got a little too focused on certain aspects of writing that sucked all the joy out of writing for me. Now, I don't have any problem writing nonfiction, technical stuff, whatever. I don't have any, but writing fiction, even now, is hard for me because I can't get that internal editor is still in my head, and I haven't figured out a way to reclaim the joy in that. So I've had to let that go. So when I returned to knitting in 2005, I did it because I wanted a specific product. I needed a wrap to wear to this writers conference I was going to. I was going to be wearing a sleeveless, formal dress. On the last day, it was very air conditioned, middle of July hotel thing. So I knew I was going to need a wrap. So I decided, I'll knit something. And so I had a very specific product in mind, and I was having so much fun knitting it. I realized that I needed to that I'd forgotten what it was like to be creative just for the sake of being creative, and not because somebody else was going to be judging it or reading it or critiquing it or whatever. It's just doing something because I loved doing it. And that's when I started really diving back into knitting and trying all different kinds of things that I'd never tried before, like knitting socks and mittens and doing more interesting hats. I'd only ever done like a stockinette hat with a roll brim. I was strictly a sweater person up to then. And I was also beginning to recognize my limit of working on one thing, a knitted thing, for only a certain amount of time before I needed to work on something else. I was starting to recognize that. And I also found out about the Master Hand Knitting program, and it was right up my alley. I knew I was going to be learning a lot and getting a lot of information. It was very exciting to me to do that at the same time as trying all these other types of projects that I hadn't tried before. But after about 3 weeks of the Master Hand Knitting program, I realized I was heading toward that perfectionism cliff that I had already gone over with my fiction writing. And I recognized what was happening. I had the same sort of emotions were starting, and I backed away from it. And I thought, I've learned a lot, and it's possible I may never finish this. I'd like to finish it, but I'm going to have to put it to the side for right now. And all the things that I'd learned in those first few weeks, I was applying to projects. I was just knitting for the fun of it. Those socks, I spent all summer knitting socks. I had a lot of fun with it. I was trying all different kinds of things. I was joining all these Yahoo groups to communicate with other knitters. I was having a lot of fun. And then at about 4 or 5 months later, I thought, you know what? I'm ready to go back and look at what I've done so far in the Master Hand Knitting program, look at it again. And I could see things that I was struggling with before that were frustrating me and I couldn't get right and that were causing me not to have joy. I had gotten better at that just by working on my projects. And so once again, I worked for about 3 weeks and then I thought, okay, I've had enough. And I immediately recognized, oh, this is my pattern. I can work on it for concentrated amounts of time and then I need a break. So that was one of the things that I learned about keeping the joy. And that's something that I eventually figured out about my projects, like large projects, like a sweater that might take more than 3 weeks. I realized that I can finish a large project. I just may not be able to finish it all in one go. So I'm happy to work on a large project for 3 weeks and then put it to the side and then readdress it some months later. 5, 6 months later. Usually that's my break period, 6 to 12 months, and then I come back to it. And I've learned in the past few years to systematically go through what are all my unfinished things so that, because sometimes I forget about them, and be reminded of what they are and then readdress them. Am I going to enjoy finishing this? If I'm not going to do it. So, but I have different motivations depending on whether I'm doing something for myself or doing something for somebody else. When it's a gift, I can tolerate knitting something that I wouldn't particularly enjoy knitting for myself because I'm knitting it for somebody that I love. So that I have a certain motivation and I know that I'm going to get something out of it that I may not be getting during the knitting process, which is that I'll be able to give a tangible expression of my love to somebody who is going to really appreciate it. So I've learned these things about myself. Now, eventually I decided to teach knitting in the local yarn shop, and I was willing to teach anything. So I taught beginning classes, I taught project classes, I taught technique classes, and eventually I also had clinics where it was like once a week for a 2-hour period. People could just come in and get any kind of help that they needed with their projects. And the idea that I had with the beginning knitting was that, oh, I'd get people hooked on knitting and then they'll take my more intermediate to advanced classes. You know, they're going to love it. But the reality was, and I learned a lot from teaching them because I could watch all the different ways that people naturally wanted to handle the yarn and needles, the kind of mistakes they made. So I learned a lot from a teaching perspective by teaching those beginning classes. So I was getting something out of it. Over time, I could predict sort of how a beginning class was going to go. And I noticed that people who take a beginning knitting class may not actually be that interested in knitting. They're taking the class to find out if they're interested in knitting. They think they might be interested in knitting. A lot of times they're like, okay, I've tried that. Now I'm going to do this other thing. You know, you just try things. And I wasn't getting a lot of people going from my beginning classes to my intermediate classes. Now you could say, well, that's because you're a terrible teacher. But I did have some students who just loved it and then took off on their own and didn't need me. So it was a mixture of things, but I found like there's so much intensive energy involved in teaching a beginning class that after a number of years, I said, I'm done teaching the beginning classes. I'll continue to teach, clinics and techniques classes, because the techniques class I can teach over and over and over again. And I haven't, I've created the class and I've created the materials and I can teach it as many times as I want in many different environments. I had also been teaching project classes, but I'd become less interested in doing that. And the reason for that was that if I wasn't the designer, and most of the time I wasn't, I had to figure out, first of all, what somebody else, what people were going to want to knit. I would have to buy the pattern and the yarn at a discount, but I had to buy them. I had to knit the item several months ahead of time, put it on display, and then wait and see if anybody signed up for the class. If nobody signed up, or if only one or two people signed up, I was lucky to break even on the money that I had already put into this class. And then the ability to teach the same project class more than a couple of times was really not there, because people wanted new things. So, and often the types of things that might be appealing to somebody, if I could figure out what that was, weren't things that I personally enjoyed knitting or had any use for. So once I stopped getting something out of teaching projects, I stopped doing that, and I focused more and more on techniques and clinics. And then and I was just feeling like I was stagnating. I was in that kind of rut, which, you know, that happens. I get into I'm learning, I'm getting a lot out of it. I'm not getting anything out of it. Then I'm just in it out of habit, and I'm not enjoying it. So it was really lucky for me that the shop ended up closing, because it forced me to readdress what I wanted to do. And I decided I'm going to try teaching on YouTube in a more systematic way, because I'd had the channel for almost 10 years, probably 9 years, and I had sporadically done things, and I'd always chosen to do things that were different or unusual. Like, here's a weird technique, and I'll do that. Thinking, well, there's lots of videos out there on beginning knitting. Why do I need to teach somebody how to do the knit stitch? So that had been my thinking, and that was still my thinking when I started doing the weekly technique videos about 1.5 years ago. I don't think that way anymore, and that's and I'm starting to realize, you know, there is room for me to teach beginning knitting on my YouTube channel, if that's something I want to do. That just because somebody else has already done it is no reason why I shouldn't do it too. So I do this sort of reevaluation pretty frequently. It's like I sort of check in with myself. Are you enjoying this? Or what are you getting out of it now? Because when I started doing weekly videos, I hadn't edited a video in forever, hadn't done a video in forever. So there was a huge learning curve for me, just figuring out how to do that and get into the rhythm of figuring out what to teach, what kind of time frame a video, you know, what the material should be that should be included in the video. And it just took me a while to do that, and that I kind of got the hang of it. And so then I added these Casual Friday videos at the beginning of this year, and now I've kind of gotten the hang of that. And I know I don't want to add not a weekly third video, but I might want to add other types of videos. And that's what I'm thinking about now, because again, I have to keep looking at what am I getting out of this. And one of the things I need to do is always be learning, and that's part of what I get back out of it. But I've also kind of built up this vault or library of knitting videos that are there. So if someone comes across my channel, there's a huge backlog of videos available for them to look at. So I feel like I have something substantial to offer people now. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the future of where this channel could go or might go, and get your feedback on that. A number of people have suggested that I do knit-alongs, and my first reaction to that is, ooh, I don't want to do that, because I have in my mind what that might mean. But I want to know what you think that means, whether or not you think that's a good idea, and what sorts of knit-along you would want. Keeping in mind, I don't like teaching other people's patterns. So it would have to be original material or something, a design that I'm producing that I also do in the context of a knit-along. It's not going to be a video on some other designer's pattern. in 99% of the time, that's not something I'm going to do. I do have plans to do, say, the 1898 hat, because there are certain techniques in it that I think are interesting. It's a very popular hat. It's one that I have knit 3 times now, and it will want to knit again. So it's worth it to me to document these techniques so that I can look back on them like, how did I do that last time? But other than that, what does a knit along mean to you? Because it seems to me like it's going through an entire project. Like the video could be the series of videos that could end up being several hours long. That's a big commitment on my part to create something like that. So I want to be careful about doing something like that. Another thing I've been thinking of is, because I do have so many videos and a lot of people are familiar with my videos on teaching style, if I did produce a series of begin to knit, like back to basics type of videos, that would be something that people could refer friends or relatives to who are interested in learning to knit and will be familiar with my videos already. So it's something I'm considering as well. So this kind of all segues into what I wanted to just mention today, which is that I've created a page on the Ko-fi website. I'm going to put it here at the bottom of the screen, and then I'll put it down in the description. Ko-fi is like it's like a tip jar for people, like for creative people who are on the internet, that you can like just buy them a coffee, they call it. And you can buy as many coffees as you want. You could even subscribe and say, I want to buy her a coffee every month, and then just unsubscribe at some point. It's similar to Patreon, but different. And I really toyed with Patreon for a long time, but it gave me a lot of anxiety trying to figure out the different levels of patronage and what the rewards would be. And I couldn't figure that out. And I didn't want it to be something tangible that I'd have to send out to people. So I just thought, I'm going to do this Ko-fi thing and see what happens. And if you like my videos and you want to support me, you can do that. I'll start just putting the links in my videos going forward. And so if there's some video you really get a lot out of and you think, oh, this really saved me, I'd like to buy Rox a coffee, you could click on my Ko-fi thing. And it does it through PayPal. I get the money directly. Ko-fi doesn't take any of the money. I get it immediately. It's not like Patreon where they take a certain percentage and they pay you once a month, or you have to reach some sort of threshold before they pay you. It just goes directly to the creator, and then I just have to pay PayPal fees, and that's it. It's been something I've thought about for like a year and a half since I started doing weekly videos. Like, do I dare ask for this? What are people how are they going to respond if I say this? I think it's time, and it's not a requirement, but I thought I would put it out there and let people know that if they like my videos and they want to support me, this is how they can do it. So I would really like your feedback, though, on what kinds of things that you might like to see on this channel that aren't just sort of one-off videos, but a special like package of videos that might happen once a year or once a quarter or twice a year or whatever, depending on what it is. So do you like the idea of me creating a back to basics series of videos? Do you like the idea of a knit along? And if you do, what does that mean to you? Like, what would you expect from a knit along? And what type of knit along would you be expecting? So that's it for this Casual Friday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.